chapter 1 of Daniel provides the key for the book of Daniel. And there are two reasons for that. First one is that it informs us that this introduction has been written at the end of the book of Daniel. I mean, we learn this from verse 21. At the end of the introduction, we learn that we have this date until the time of Cyrus. So we understand from that this chapter 1, which is the introduction to the whole book, was composed once the whole book had been written. So that's the first reason. Second reason is that when we read this chapter, we discover, having in mind, once we've read the whole book actually, we discover that this chapter contains most of the themes, if not all the themes we will find in the book of Daniel, which then is indicating that we should expect to find there in this introduction clues that will enlighten the rest of the book, forthcoming text, and even unlock some of the problems. And so I would like to bring this, to understand these lessons we are learning from chapter 1, providing with the key to the book of Daniel on 5 levels. First level, history, the historical level. The second level, prophecy, the prophetic text. Third level, theology, the thought, the theology of the text. Fourth level, literary, the form of the text, the structure of the text. And the last one, certainly not the least one, the existential level. So these 5 levels, on these 5 levels we are going to understand that indeed chapter 1 anticipates the whole book and provides us the key for the whole book. So the first one, then, the history. We learn already that from the very beginning that this is what the chapter 1 is indicating. We begin with Nebuchadnezzar, that's the first line, and we end with Cyrus. That's the last line of chapter 1. And we have right here the beginning of the whole book of Daniel and the end of the book of Daniel. So we learn from this information that this book, this chapter, was written by someone who had already written everything before. So we know that what he's going to talk about, and that's the information, the historical information we are receiving from this chapter, is that the whole course of history from Nebuchadnezzar to Cyrus is going to be visited. And of course, the second, another point of history is that we in this chapter we already are exposed to the condition of exile, condition of the people who are there. They are oppressed, they are persecuted, they are humiliated, but they resist at the same time. They resist on every level to keep to their identity, to keep to be faithful. And we learn this when we go into the book of Daniel. We also see indeed this condition of exile in chapter 2, in chapter 3, chapter 6, and also the oppression, and also, of course, their resistance. What we see in chapter 1 is reappears in further chapters. And yet, and that will be another point of history which is indicated, Daniel and the 3 Hebrews are part of history. They're not outside of history. They are engaged in that history. They are engaged even at the highest level. They occupy high positions and they counsel the king. So they are part of that history which is going on from Nebuchadnezzar to Cyrus himself. So chapter 1 again can show us what we are going to discover in more details, more developed in the rest of the book, So on that level of history, this is what we are learning. The second level, this is the level of prophecy. In chapter 1, in verse 21, for instance, we notice that this is the time of the fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy. This is we are learning there that this is the first year of Cyrus, and we know that this is the time of the fulfillment of the 70 years, which Jeremiah indicated as being the time of the exile. And by the same token, this is an allusion to the 70 weeks prophecy, because the 70 years of Jeremiah, as we will learn, are a springboard to the 70 weeks prophecy. So we have allusion to this prophecy already in chapter 1, because we see that this is the fulfillment of a prophecy. At the same time it prepares for the other prophecy. Also, the prophecy of the 23 evenings and morning, which is found in chapter 8, is also alluded to. We have in chapter 1 the story of a test, and the test of the three Hebrews and Daniel. They are going to be tested, and already the idea of test is bringing with it an allusion to a judgment, to a moment of trial, and they will be tested, and they will survive the test, and they will be victorious in the test. And so it's interesting that there are 10 days of preparation for the test, which reminds of the 10 days which are just before the Day of Atonement. That's also a slight allusion to the time of the Atonement. So that's already, and this story, by the way, which is talking about the experience of the Hebrews and Daniel, experience of tests, is situated exactly in the middle of the chapter. So that's already an indication that, as we will see later on again, that really there is an allusion to something which is coming, which is really the Day of Atonement, there, which is also in the middle of chapter 7 and chapter 8. Interesting. But the Day of Atonement in chapter 1 is in the middle of the chapter, just as the Day of Atonement is in the middle of the whole book of Daniel in chapter 7 and chapter 8. And the Day of Atonement is also in the middle of each chapter. Chapter 7, you look at where the place of the judgment, the Day of Judgment is, it's exactly in the middle. And in chapter 8, the same way. So the structure, the thought, the themes are pointing to the 2300 in the morning. You prepare to the 2300 in the morning. Not only that, we have also the language, the mar'eh. The word mar'eh, it's a technical term which we will discover in very well, emphasized in chapter 8, referring to this is the context of the Day of Atonement, when we have a heavenly scene, and this heavenly scene is associated with the word mar'eh. Yeah, and then the word mar'eh is also used here in chapter 1. In chapter 1, of course, it doesn't refer exactly to the same thing, but it's a technical term which normally is used to refer to, the personality of weight, personality of impressive personality, and in New King James Version, the word mar'eh is translated good-looking people. Right? It doesn't sound very well in English, but I mean, this is a very strange, very rare term. It has also been translated spectacular, impressive people. In this phrase, this word, by the way, is used in the scriptures to refer to for instance, a prophet or an angel or a divine being. So this word, mar'eh, is preparing us for, which is really, this word mar'eh, which is very special, is already anticipating, announcing the mar'eh which we will have in the context of the Day of Atonement. Not only that, we have the echo. We have an echo on words. The word yamim days in the verse. When we have, in chapter 1, it talks about Yamim, the end of Yamim, the end of days. This phrase which is used at end of days, Yamim, Ketz Yamim. In fact, it is echoed in chapter 2, in chapter 12 at the end of the book. Whereas in here, the Yamim, the days, are literal days, 24 hours in chapter 1, but in chapter 12 they are referring to years. A way, indirect way, suggesting that kind of connection between years and days. He's kind of bringing the two together, making that association to prepare us for also to understand that the principle of the day-year principle. Okay, so that's what for prophecy. Now, the theology. We have a number of important theological themes in chapter 1, which you will see are very important in the whole book. The first theological theme we have comes out of the first verse, actually. This is the theological theme of the great controversy. We begin with that. We read the first verse and we learn there that Babel, the king of Nebuchadnezzar, comes against Jerusalem. We have this first scene here, which already prepares us for the rest. And the second verse adds to that, because there we have the word Shinar, which is a rare term. This is the old name of Babel, the word we find in Genesis 11, in verse 10. And with this Shinar, the word Shinar immediately brings to the mind the story of the Tower of Babel. And we immediately understand by this association of terms, we have Babel against Jerusalem, and we have the word Shinar, that there is here an opposition, a war, a controversy between Babel and God's people. And what is Babel? Babel characterizes precisely this power, which is the false religion, which is full of pride and arrogance. This is what Babel and Babylon represents in the scriptures. And so from the very beginning, we understand that there is this whole book will be dealing with a conflict of another order, which is a spiritual order. So the king of Babylon is here represented as the power that takes God's place, right? And we will see that in the narrative part, in chapter 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, Babylon is precisely characterized as a persecuting power and even as a usurping power. Nebuchadnezzar wants to take God's place, at the same time he persecutes, right? And Belshazzar the same thing, and Darius the same thing. So what we see on a historical level in chapter 1 is going, from the very beginning, it announces what is going to happen in the narrative part, in chapter 2, 3, 4, 5, in the first part until chapter 7. And in the prophetic part, that is chapter 2, chapter 7, and 11 and 12, we can see that here also we have a power of usurpation, a power of persecution, which is represented by symbols, more precisely symbol of the little horn, right, which takes God's place and persecutes God's people. And it appears, this is a power which appears at the end of the course of history, and it represents the last evil power which will dominate and the great controversy. Now, there is also something else as far as the great controversy is concerned. The geopolitical situation we are confronted with right there in chapter 1 is very interesting, because it brings together three powers. We have Babylon, of course, Nebuchadnezzar. We have people of Israel, but we have also a third power which is implied, which is the power of Egypt. because the result, the event we are confronted with right now in chapter 1 is the result of a particular dynamic. We see that Nebuchadnezzar comes against Egypt because Israel, the king of Israel, wanted to ally with Egypt, and so Nebuchadnezzar comes against Egypt, and there is a battle. This is the Battle of Carchemish, and as a result, Daniel is taken in a prisoner. And so the first chapter, it brings together three powers, so to speak. So you have the power of the north, Babylon, and you have the power of the south, Egypt, and we have God's people. When we reach chapter 11, which is really the climax of the great controversy, we are again exposed to this dynamic of the king of the north, the king of the south, and God's people in the middle, who is really, torn, and who will also be oppressed, and who will ultimately, of course, survive thanks to God's intervention. So this is then that's what we have about the great controversy. There is another theology in chapter 1, which is also an important one, which is really implied, and it is the theology of creation. Right there in chapter 1, verse 12, we have three words associated. When everyone remembers when Daniel made that statement, in order to justify his choice of food, he says, "Give us vegetables to eat," and he used three words together: the word give, vegetables, eat, and the association of these three words are only found in Genesis 1, verse 29, where we learn there that God gives vegetables to eat, and so we have here an allusion to creation. A theology of creation is already implied right there as he's is eating. It's interesting that first the word give, the verb give, of course, is an important verb. The first time that the verb is used in biblical, in the scriptures, this is when God gives food. And so Daniel also, stands like Adam there, and he uses the word give, reminding of creation, and at the same time indicating where he stands, the way he's thinking. He owes his life to the one he owes his food, that is the Creator. And so that implies creation, the theology of creation here versus those who were, of course, worshipping the idols, worshipping the kings, that is creatures or created, fabricated things. Okay, so another theology which is used also is eschatology, that is the theology of the end. Interesting, the word end is used several times. Ketz is used several times in chapter 1. By the way, this is a word which is used more used in the book of Daniel than it is in any other book in the Bible. So this is really the word end, the word ketz, that the word end in English is a key word in the book of Daniel, and we have this in chapter 1, preparing for understanding that this whole book of Daniel is about the end. It's about eschatology. And more interesting, the fact that the phrase he uses in verse 15, verse 18, which articulates the chapter, makes kind of a refrain, miktzat yamim, at the end of the day, at the end of days. Kind of the structure is really marked by this phrase. This phrase, end of days, points to the last words of the book, which is ketz yamin, also end of days, indicating that although these days refer to periods of time in their own life, they received through this association, through this echo, we understand that these words are not used for nothing. They are actually preparing for eschatology. They receive eschatological content. So in chapter 1, you understand that Daniel is really oriented eschatologically. Okay, so that's that. And then we have, of course, resurrection, the idea of resurrection. Resurrection after 10 days, we see that 10 days of fasting, as if they are not eating like the others. From the point of view of the Babylonians, these people are dead. They are not eating like us, and then in spite of this, 10 times better, 10 times stronger at the end. And indeed, they are better than the others. So what comes after that, after this moment of fasting, of death, is better. And this is something we discover also later on, after the fiery furnace in Lion's Den. What comes after is better than what it was before, pointing to resurrection, chapter 3, chapter 6. The sovereignty of God. God did, God gave, the Lord gave. That's also a phrase which articulates the chapter, articulates the structure. And again, the verb Nathan, gave, which is an important word in the book of It's used 17 times in the book of This is a key word in this chapter. I have already mentioned that. Okay, and so we are learning right there that this is God who is behind. God give Israel in the hand of. God give wisdom. God give food. Always God behind. He's the sovereign. He's the one who, guides, directs the events. Fourth point, the literary. Fourth level, the literary. The literary structure of chapter 1, with the devotement in the middle, of course, anticipates the literary structure of the whole book. We have in chapter 7 and chapter 8, which are also about the devotement in the center, as we already indicated. But there is something else about the literary lesson we are learning, is that in chapter 1, we are discovering, we become aware of the connection, the presence of wisdom and apocalyptic. On one hand, we have people who are wise, and also we have people who are transported in a miracle, and who are waiting for God's salvation. So we have a kind of a connection between the apocalyptic and the wisdom, the hope and the wisdom. It's interesting that this is something we learned also in the book of Daniel. The first part of the book that reports the life of the Hebrews, which are in touch with the world. They live according to wisdom, wisdom ideals of ethics and justice, and also enjoyment of creation. And this is also in the context of the book. This interact with prophetic material. In chapter 1, in the first part, we have the wisdom of people. And then we have prophecies. And in the second part of the book of Daniel, when we had prophetic text, we have also there, in the middle, we have chapter 9 talking about the prayer and prayer of intercession, and talking about and warning, the God's people because they were not faithful, because they were wicked, they did not apply righteousness. And so we have, in a way, kind of intermingling between the wisdom and apocalyptic here. That supports, of course, the literary unity of the book. They are not separated; they belong together. And this is, by the way, that first of all, it alerts us against any reductionist temptation to define the literary genre of the text of Daniel, simply saying they are apocalyptic, when in fact they are mixed with wisdom. What we are, in fact, if we want to find the real label to identify the literary genre of Daniel, it would be wisdom apocalyptic. That would be the right definition, the right identity of the literary genre. And for the religious leader, the religious reader, this particular connection between wisdom and apocalyptic, showing that they are always together, implies the same degree of attention. There is nothing better here. The apocalyptic is not better than the wisdom, and the wisdom is not better than the apocalyptic. And it's an invitation, actually, for us to read wisdom and apocalyptic together and not separated, and not neglect one at the expense of the other. It's interesting, by the way, that we have many wisdom texts which also have apocalyptic features, like, for instance, the book of Job, like the book of Song of Songs, like the book of Ecclesiastes. The Ecclesiastes at the end, Song of Songs, we have the knocking at the door, which is also repeated in the book of Revelation, and Job, who is also longing for hope, longing for salvation. And then finally, right, we have the existential level, which is represented in tension. We have an existential tension of holiness. Immediately after Daniel, I'm reading now in chapter 1, verse 8, purposed in his heart that he would not defile, it is said that God brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And this suggests, by the way, the duty of God's people who are, of course, who wants to be separated from the world, who have to be separated from the world, who do not eat like the others, who do not behave like the others, and yet it is said that they should have a relationship. It is said that God brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs, suggesting that the duty of God's people to entertain with the world and even with the pagan enemy a relationship of favor and compassion. Paradoxically, we could say that the life of holiness that requires separation from the pagan world and its polluting habit, read chapter 1, verse 8, does not exclude a relationship of love and grace with the people of the world. And in parallel, we could say that the Hebrews have wisdom and skill in all literature of the world. They're not just dealing with with the Bible. They are interested also in the world's wisdom, and so they are. While at the same time, they are scrutinized and have understanding of the prophetic revelation. So their attention to the apocalyptic truth that concerns heavenly realities is conjugated with an acute awareness of the present time of human earthly existence. Now, existential tension of hope. A powerful illustration of this principle is found in the Hebrew phrase miktzat yamin. I have already mentioned that phrase, at the end of the days, which is echoes in the last word of the book of Daniel, in the phrase ketz yamin, at the end of days, which designate the end of human history, when Daniel, with all the saved ones, will, of course, receive their inheritance. And Daniel here applies the eschatological expression to refer to his present situation, to his present life. And this contains an important lesson for those who like to emphasize the vision of the future and are interested in eschatological prophecy. That's us, right? And the hope of the future kingdom, that's the lesson we are learning, is not disconnected from the present existence, but on the contrary, should have an impact on our present life. The future kingdom of God invades the present existence, which then becomes an actual living testimony to the heavenly realities of the future kingdom. So the association of wisdom and apocalyptic material also confronts us as God's people with an important lesson. The passion for the prophecy of this eschatological advent that make us dream and pray and think beyond these times should walk hand in hand and in tension with the law of the seventh day, with its ideals of justice, ethics, and strong connection with the present time in our history and in our existence, because this is one of the profound lessons of the seventh day. This is not just a day of rest, it's a day which also contains all these ideals of justice, ethics, and connection with time. So in conclusion, and I would say the last lesson, we are called here for more attention to this on this chapter, which is generally neglected. We are interested in the stories of Daniel later on. We are interested in the prophecy, but we don't pay attention to chapter 1, which actually prepares and provides us with important paths to better understand what is going to follow. So it is an important chapter because it's important to help us better understand the prophecy that will come later in the book, which is promised at the end of the book in chapter 12, verse 10. At the end of time, there will be people who will understand better. But interestingly, also, and perhaps more importantly, to understand this chapter will help us understand better our identity as Seventh-day Adventists. This is the key to chapter 1, to the book of Daniel, which is provided in chapter 1.